Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We are continuing our discussion of the period of English settlement, looking at the various regions and kinds of settlements that were established in this period. We're focusing now on the Chesapeake colonies. In the previous lecture, we talked about Jamestown and the difficulties that that colony had surviving from the very beginning. Now what we're going to see is that Jamestown and the Virginia colony does, of course, survive and begins to establish stability with the passage of time, and particularly beginning under the leadership of John Smith. John Smith was an accomplished soldier who seized control in Jamestown in 1608, and being a soldier and something of a tough character, he instilled discipline in the colonists. If you remember in the previous lecture, we talked about how many of the colonists in Virginia just weren't interested in doing the kinds of things that you needed to survive in that period. And John Smith, under the force of his own leadership, he is out there in the fields planting things, growing things, and thus compels others to join him in that endeavor. Now, one of the interesting tales from this early period is that of Pocahontas. And John Smith, in his own account, told a riveting tale of how he was captured by the Powhatan Indians and saved just as he was about to be executed by a young Indian girl named Pocahontas. Now, historians differ as to the veracity of that account, and most believe that there is some version of that story that's true. It seems likely that Smith was captured. We're not sure under what pressure he was to perhaps be executed at that time, and how Pocahontas might have intervened. But in all likelihood, she was there in some capacity, and she might have intervened to assist Smith and perhaps to take part in an adoption ritual, which was common at that time, that prisoners might be adopted into the tribe. But Pocahontas' more important impact comes a few years later. She was the daughter of the Powhatan chief at that time, and thus a figure of importance. And a couple of years after this episode with John Smith, she was captured by the English, who had decided this was going to be one way to improve relations with the Indians at that time, to holding her captive and hoping for a peace treaty. Eventually, she is brought back to England, where she marries one of the leading settlers, whose name was John Rolfe. And scholars, again, disagree as to why exactly this was done and how it took place, but it seems to be indicative of an important role that women could play in the relations between settlers and Indians at that time, and that is this sort of peacemaking role. Now, unfortunately, Pocahontas died in England just about a year after she was brought back there, and so we're left to wonder what impact she might have had more broadly over time had she survived. In any case, under the leadership of John Smith, assisted by Pocahontas and the Native Americans themselves, conditions began to improve and stabilize in Jamestown. The hardship persisted. The winter of 1609 to 1610 is actually known as the starving time, when many residents in Jamestown starved to death or died of illness. And I described in the previous lecture the shocking mortality rate in Jamestown. Even after things began to improve, we still see a very, very high mortality rate. Between 1607 and 1622, approximately 10,000 settlers arrived in Jamestown. And at the end of that period, only about 2,000 remained alive. So even after the situation begins to stabilize, the mortality rate is shockingly high. Now, how is it that Jamestown managed to survive and stabilized? In a word, tobacco. The Virginians finally found their crop and the product by which they might begin to make a profit, and that was tobacco. Tobacco was first planted in Virginia in about 1611 by John Rolfe, who was experimenting with the product at that time. And in 1613, he shipped the first shipment of tobacco back to England. As it happened, the crop took off. It grew very well in those coastal regions of Virginia, and there was demand for it back in England. And so the residents of Jamestown began to grow tobacco literally everywhere, even growing tobacco in the streets of Jamestown at that time. By 1629, they were exporting more than 1 million pounds of tobacco back to England each year. So what is the impact of this emphasis on tobacco in the nature of the Virginia colony? Well, there are lots of things we can talk about, and to some degree I'll continue this discussion in future lectures. But some of the things we can point to here are that because they were emphasizing tobacco above all else, they were then required to import everything else. So they were essentially not growing sufficient food for themselves. They weren't trying to grow or make other products. And so you began to have this robust sort of trading economy, but it relied on bringing everything else in other than the tobacco which they exported. This also finally again led to the stabilizing and ultimately the expansion of the colony as they began growing more and more tobacco and taking more and more land under the crop. They began to expand, and that ultimately led them into conflict with the Indians surrounding the colony. We're going to talk about some of those conflicts in future lectures and in the next chapter. The reliance on tobacco and this cash crop also meant that Virginia was a predominantly male colony throughout this early period. Few women were brought as they were not seen to be so helpful in terms of raising and growing crops. Eventually, that relationship between men and women is going to start to even out, but in the early years, the Virginia colony is overwhelmingly male. We're also going to see that it's under this emphasis on tobacco crop that the colony itself begins to become better organized and well established. One of the things that residents in Virginia are going to try to do is encourage other people to come and settle, because the more people they had, the stronger the colony would become. And eventually they established the headright system, which encouraged additional immigrants by offering 50 acres of land to anyone who would come to Virginia, plus another 50 acres for each person they brought with them. This is the headright system, and it's under that system that the Virginia colony begins to grow. We're also going to see that the reliance on tobacco is going to lead early Virginia more and more to rely on African slaves as a labor source. Now, initially, there's some emphasis on Native American labor in the beginning. Then they move to indentured servants, and then eventually relying on African slaves. But tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop, and they're going to need lots of workers. We're going to be talking about this much more in future lectures. I also want to mention here the other of the Chesapeake colonies, which was Maryland. Maryland was established as what is known as a proprietary colony, and the proprietor of the colony was Lord Baltimore. This is actually a picture of the second Lord Baltimore, also named Cecil or Cecilius. And proprietary colonies were granted their authority by the king, in this case Charles I. In 1632, Charles I of England granted a charter to George Calvert, who was the first Lord Baltimore, the father of the man pictured here. Calvert died soon after, and thus it is the second Lord Baltimore, Cecil, who becomes the proprietor in what becomes Maryland. This was named after Henrietta Maria, who was the queen married to Charles I. Lord Baltimore saw Maryland, this new colony, as a safe haven for Catholics who were being persecuted in England. And so that was the nature of Maryland in this early period. It was a tolerant colony that was supportive of religious freedom. Now, proprietors had enormous power in their colonies, and we're going to talk about some other examples of proprietary colonies in the next lecture. But one thing this meant is that it led to some challenges in governance as colonists sought more authority, but they were governed by these proprietors, in this case, Lord Baltimore. And we see in Maryland some challenges between the colonists and Lord Baltimore over control, and eventually they do settle on some compromises in the nature of power in the colonies. So, let me offer a few just concluding kind of summary points related to the Chesapeake colonies. First of all, we see an overwhelming reliance on the staple crop of tobacco, which leads both to the stability and the economic thriving of the colony, but also the same factors that I talked about in the previous slide, most notably a reliance on African slaves. We've talked about the high mortality rate in the Chesapeake colonies, which remains much higher than some of the other regions among the English colonies, even after the colony stabilizes and the mortality rate levels off to some extent. The Chesapeake was characterized by a rough frontier society. Establishments tend to be spread out, and there's a lot more kind of individual survival in the Chesapeake compared to some other regions we're going to be talking about. At the same time, if one could survive, the Chesapeake offered great opportunity for wealth and advancement. If you didn't die off within your first year or two of being in the Chesapeake region, you were likely to acquire land as those around you did die off. So we'll be talking about that down the road as well. I've mentioned already the reliance on African slavery, which is going to be a topic of great discussion in the next several lectures. And finally, life in the Chesapeake tended to mirror gentry life back in England. You were characterized by this gentry class that tended to rule things, and eventually we're going to talk about a lower and working class of indentured servants and African slaves that also tended to characterize life in the Chesapeake. Now, in our next few lectures, we're going to be looking at the other regions among the English settlements and talking about some comparison and contrast with what we've just spoken about here in the Chesapeake.